In 18th century British North America, it was impossible for Roman Catholics to practice their faith, except in a tiny number of very limited localities. Then in the 19th century, practice of the faith becomes possible almost everywhere in the United States, although discrimination against and hatred of Roman Catholics remain commonplace. Finally, in the second half of the 20th century, discrimination ended and Catholics became fully equal participants in American life. Why did these transformations in the role of Catholicism in America occur when they did? That is my question for this morning. In particular, I want to focus on what was special about the years around 1800 that resulted in ending what had been a collective paranoia about Roman Catholicism in most of Britain's 13 American colonies, a paranoia that kept Catholicism out of existence. New York City is a perfect example. In 1700, there were fewer than a dozen Roman Catholics in the city. Even in a city that tolerated Jews, Catholicism remained officially unwelcome. Anyone hiding a priest, for example, was subject to a fine of 200 pounds. 40 years later, a man named John Urey, a private tutor with expertise in Latin, was charged with being a Catholic priest and of leading a slave conspiracy, accused of practicing, quote, a hocus-pocus bloody religion. Urey was convicted and executed. 4 soldiers from the royal garrison, Peter Connolly, Edward Kelly, Edward Murphy, and Andrew Ryan, were also suspected of being Catholics and duly arrested. By the 1780s, change had begun to occur, with nearly 1,000 Catholics residing in the city. During the War of Independence, a Jesuit named Ferdinand Steinmeier had slipped into the city and celebrated Mass for the first time secretly in a house on Wall Street. After the Revolutionary War, legal restrictions on Catholic worship were eliminated, and Steinmeier gathered his congregation and said Mass regularly in a loft over a carpenter's shop on Barclay Street. The cornerstone of New York City's first Roman Catholic church, St. Peter's, was laid in 1785, and by 1806 there were some 10,000 Catholics in the city. But hatred, prejudice, and discrimination remained. In the 1830s, a nuns' convent in Massachusetts was burned. 2 decades later, the Know Nothing Party briefly sprang into existence. As late as the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan burned crosses on the lawns of Catholic parishes that were being constructed on Long Island. And when New York's governor, Alfred E. Smith, campaigned for the presidency in 1928, he witnessed the burning of crosses by the Klan as he traveled around the country. It is difficult to imagine anti-Catholicism of this nature today, but it is only in our lifetimes that it has ended. So why the change? In particular, what happened in the years around 1800 that made it possible for Roman Catholics in America, much as they remained disliked, to attend Mass and otherwise practice their faith? The answer, I suggest, is that in the middle of the 18th century, religion was not primarily about God, but about political, economic, and social hegemony. The Protestant Reformation had not only been about the Catholic Church's corruption and about returning to the egalitarian moral values and organizational structure of early Christianity. It had also been about stopping the drain of German money to Italy and about making England, Germany, and the Netherlands independent of the Habsburgs. Think about the changes that the Reformation brought to England. Catholicism meant that the English crown was allied with Spain, first through the marriage of Henry VIII to a Spanish princess, and then through the marriage of Bloody Mary to the Spanish king. When Henry and then his daughter Elizabeth broke those alliances, Englishmen became free to trade with the rebellious Dutch and to plunder Spanish shipping. Arguably the most important effect over 2.5 centuries of Catherine's failure to bear Henry a son was the creation of the British Empire and the demise of the Spanish one. Think also about the changes internally in England. As a result of the Reformation and the destruction of the monasteries, vast tracts of land changed hands. Secular landlords probably were more entrepreneurial than monastic ones would have been, and younger men who went into the military or into trade had a far greater impact on spreading English power overseas than monks would have had. The destruction of the monasteries simply changed the structure of power in English society, and probably had more to do with the religious choices of English families than did faith in the religious primacy of either the Bishop of Rome or the Archbishop of Canterbury. Let us turn to colonial America, first Massachusetts. I do not mean to deny the religious impetus behind Puritanism, but Puritanism was as concerned with the political and economic organization of society as it was with God. It was as much a social philosophy as a set of religious beliefs. In traditional European society, political, economic, and social power had been based on bloodlines and inheritance. In Puritan Massachusetts, in contrast, power came from the intellectual attainment and commitment to community. The men who ran England were the sons of men who had previously run England, but the men who governed Massachusetts were those who participated with others in their community in discussing and interpreting the textual words in the Bible constituting the community's foundation stones. The struggle between Anglicans and Puritans was less about the vestments that ministers wore on Sunday and more about who could access power and how they could access it. To ensure that Puritans won the struggle in Massachusetts, only men who were full members of Puritan congregations were permitted to vote. Colonial Massachusetts was not unique in the connections it drew between religion on the one hand and political, economic, and social hegemony on the other. In South Carolina, Anglicans gained control of the government by requiring anyone elected to the legislature to take an oath before assuming his seat that he conformed to the Church of England and had not taken communion in any other church during the previous year. When Trinity Church was opened in New York in 1698, its vestry declared that the time had ended when, quote, for want of a temple for the public worship according to the English Church, New York City seemed rather like a conquered foreign province held by the terror of a garrison than an English colony possessed and settled by people of our own nation. And in Maryland, the Catholic Lords Baltimore appointed mainly Catholics to the bench and other high posts in government when they were in control. For example, 19 of the 27 men who sat on the Governor's Council from 1666 to 1689 were Catholic, and 15 of the 19 were related by blood or marriage to Lord Baltimore's family. But when, as a result of the Glorious Revolution in England, Protestants gained control of Maryland, an act of Parliament required office holders to take 2 oaths, one declaring that no foreign prince or potentate, quote, ought to have any jurisdiction or authority, ecclesiastical or spiritual, unquote, over any English dominions, and another proclaiming belief that there is not any transubstantiation in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. The requirement of these oaths effectively excluded Catholics from office in Maryland, thereby giving Protestants political and, over time, economic and social hegemony as well. Perhaps the best illustration that I can give of the connection between religion and other forms of hegemony in the 18th century comes from a case out of Middleborough, Massachusetts. A townsman was sued for debt on a writ of capias, which meant that he was placed in jail. He asked the church congregation to put up bail for him. The members refused. The debtor, they declared, was not in good standing with the church, and therefore they had no obligation to assist him. He remained in jail. Religious pluralism was not an option for most 18th century British colonials. It existed in a few places such as New York City, but in most localities, everybody belonged to a single church. Religious pluralism and toleration were an anomaly. Accepting Catholicism thus did not entail toleration. It meant changing religion. And changing religion meant not only that Sunday services would be different, but that the people who controlled the political, economic, and social life of the locality would also be different. The American Revolution broke the link between religion on the one hand and political, economic, and social hegemony on the other. When Protestants could no longer agree, and I think this is the key point, as they could not in the 1780s, about which sect would dominate religious life, and through it, political, economic, and social life, they created a competitive religious environment in lieu of a monopolistic one. In this new competitive religious world, a man could no longer gain control over other people by becoming a leader of a religious denomination. Again, I can illustrate with an example from a small town in early 19th century Massachusetts, where a young unmarried woman became pregnant. When the leaders of the local Congregational church visited her and informed her that she would need to confess to the congregation and accept its punishment, they found they no longer had power. She informed them that rather than confess, she would go down the street and join a new and different church. Thus, the American Revolution was not simply a war of independence. It produced transformative social change in that it took power away from the lay leaders of local churches and transferred it to people who simply possessed wealth. The transfer was not a dramatic one, given that 18th century religious leaders usually had been men of wealth. Nonetheless, the transfer was significant because it made toleration and religious pluralism possible. In particular, in a world where church leaders as such no longer had power over other people simply because they were church leaders, accepting Catholicism no longer entailed change in the structure of societal power. The same rich people who had always controlled New York could continue to control it, while poor Catholics who no longer constituted a threat to those in power could be left free to practice their faith. But discrimination against Catholics persisted, and in part as a result, Catholics for over a century remained largely poor and powerless. It was only in the aftermath of World War II that discrimination ended. By then, two other changes had also occurred. One, as a result of the war, the U.S. economy for a time dominated the world. American enterprises needed all the talent they could get, including Catholic talent, and there was enough money around to compensate that talent without taking money from the established rich. Many Catholics became wealthy. Two, Catholics had internalized American values. They had learned to live in a competitive religious world in which they did not need to follow what the church commanded politically. As President Kennedy famously declared, he would take no orders from a pope or bishop. Catholicism, in short, had become American, and many Catholics, in consequence, attained positions of political and societal leadership. In conclusion, I suggest that we look back 300 rather than 200 years. In 1713, religion was a key element in the apparatus of social control. Changes in religion entailed change in rulers. Protestants could not tolerate Catholics in such a world. By 1813, the link between religion and social control had been broken in America, and new mechanisms of control, the capitalist marketplace and professional police, to cite two examples, had begun to emerge. Catholics could then be tolerated, although not within the ruling class. Only when Catholics had fully accepted the American norm of religious pluralism and competition, and only after John Kennedy had made that acceptance plain to the nation could Catholics be fully accepted into the governing class.